There's no denying it. The world is in crisis. Unless you're pure transcendent mind or a nihilist, you might not be fine with it. You might be sick. The climate shifts, titans and tyrants vie for the tightest grip. The crises are diverse. But one might inquire if all of these agonized varieties of strife and rift are underlined by what their one bottom line is. Avarice, affluence, influence, finance. It's a common refrain. Blame the economists. But what job is named by that name? Is it obvious? Is the job that has the broadest effect upon the populace? It would probably be best to define what its province is. Ecos means house. Nomos means rules. It's the rules of the house. But whose house is whose? Why do people lose their houses like you see on the news? People may not be economists, but not all are fools. So what are its tools, and what are its concepts, and what are their underlying ideological contents when we talk about growth, gross domestic product? Just because we've got growth, does growth mean progress? Does it often benefit these and not those? As it speaks the open secrets ideologies impose, do we need to rearrange how economics goes? Rearranged economic spells comic nose. Economic questions, it's an economic question. What the heck is going on? It's an economic question. How's it all connected? How's it gonna get corrected in the present and beyond? It's an economic question. What's the GDP per capita? The total output that's in a society divided by the people that it has in it. The peak in economic speak that's like a country's stamina. The data that when gathered demonstrate its people have the stuff they need. But do they need it? What's that mean? We need to eat. But do we really need a piece of every piece of green in Eden? Are the goods we manufacture really good because they sell? Does economic well-being really mean being well? Could theories be objective when theorists depend on the patronage of people who are able to spend? Does it work for the layman or for them who can lend? Can we make ends meet while we meet common ends? Economic questions, it's an economic question. What is going on? It's an economic question. How's it all connected? How's it gonna get corrected in the present and beyond? It's an economic question. I don't have the answers. I'm not a prophet, nor am I a master of the science of profit. Whether that science is misapplied or a proper fit is up to us. It's something that the science could not predict. If you want better answers, you need better questions. The best preventive medicine against the depression. All the young economists with honest intentions. I'll see you at the YSI plenary session.
Hello from the Lighthouse. We're coming to you live. We're on day 7 of the YSI virtual plenary, and I'm hoping you're having a great time and you're enjoying it as much as I have. As you've seen, we're seeing an expansion of the galaxy. We have so many new questions being added, and I'm really looking forward to the remaining day because we have 2 really amazing sessions that we are about to embark on. Next up in the schedule, of course, is Michael Sandel, who's going to be joined by Rana Faruha in the session we're looking to right now. Later in the evening and later today, after that, following that, is a live Q&A with Daniel Ellsberg and Rob Johnson. But if we take a look at the whole day, I think we've also just had an amazing announcement. If you didn't catch it, we did hear from George Soros and his 3 questions, and we had 3 questions and a letter from Pope Francis. So you'll see those later on today as we wrap up the day. We'll show you those questions once again. But now let's move into today's session. Today's session with Michael Sandel and Rana Faruha is taking place in the societal organization Constellation. As you know, we're here to explore new economic questions, and we would like to, with you, try to put some questions in front of Michael and Rana for them to consider whether those are worthy questions for us to consider and whether they're open enough questions for research in the YSI community going forward. Now, go into the Constellation and join the meeting, and how that exactly works when you're in the session, we'll see a video to explain that right now.
First, go to ysiplenary.org and click the night sky. This is the questions fair, where each star is a question, and each group of stars, or constellation, contains questions within a particular topic. You can find questions fair sessions in the schedule in the left sidebar and join them from there. Just enter the session and join the Zoom. As you listen to the speaker motivate their questions, think about which questions you believe to be pertinent for YSI. While the speaker talks, suggest your questions to your peers by entering them into the panel. This is not a Q&A. The questions are suggestions for research in YSI, not a question for the speaker to answer. Take a look at all the questions that were suggested and like the ones that you think are best. The questions moderator will select the most liked questions and present them to the speaker for a comment. These questions will be added to the constellation, where they can be further refined. Refine the questions by finding the best exact phrasing. Suggest a rephrasing yourself, or like the rephrasings that you think are good. After the session is over, you can find the submitted questions in the constellations. As a plenary participant, you can mark your 10 favorite questions in the graph. Just click the star in the corner of the questions card, and they will be added to your YSI profile. The most popular questions will make it into the final list.
And we're ready now to go up into the constellation. Rana and Michael are ready for us. But let me make a final check if everything is okay. Thomas Voss, session moderator, check. Cecilia, question moderator, check. Rana, Michael, you're both good to go? All right, let's send you up to the constellation. See you there.
As one gets born and dies, how is one society organized? It's hard to keep it balanced, authoring these rap hits in economics classes. Kinda like it's hard among the economic classes. Are you in the 1% or eking it with the masses? See what happens? Does it sturdy or stunted when we treat the earth's resources like it's hunter or hunted? The wealth in this country's like 1 in 100. I'ma keep it 100. If you're one of the one kids, does the differential bother you too much to enjoy it? Why are some subsidized and some are highly exploited? Is each of us alone within our niche of employment? Or are all of us responsible to pitch in and join it? And what's the role of government in making a call? How the effort of one affects the well-being of all? What's the pattern of the spiral of societal sprawl? And how to find a balance? Without it we fall. As one gets organized, how is one society organized?
My name is Cecilia Ricab. I'm the outgoing coordinator of the States and Markets Working Group, and I'm the question moderator of this session. As you already know and heard a couple of times already, I'm sure, the aim of our YSI virtual plenary is to collectively arrive at the 100 most inspiring and pertinent questions of our time. We will do research based on those questions. We will build our mandates for next year based on these questions and create a lot of projects for you to join and collaborate. This, as I said then, is a collaborative process, and we are drawing inspiration from stimulating speakers. Today, in this session, we have the honor to listen and also discuss with Michael Sandel. We are in the social organization constellation, and we will also hear the intervention and questions of Rana Faruha. So during their talk, as you already know, you will have the chance to suggest new questions. You just need to get inside the plenary platform, inside the night sky, in this session, and you will be able to suggest new questions. At the same time, you will be able to like questions from other participants, and the questions receiving most likes will be asked after his talk to Michael Sandel. Our aim will not be to receive final answers from him, but actually to receive further insights and ideas on how we can continue developing these questions and working on them in the near future. So without further ado, I will hand it on to Thomas, who is the session moderator of this talk.
Thank you, Cecilia, and welcome to Professor Sandel and Rana Faruha. It's an honor. I must say I'm a bit starstruck on being here at the same call as you two and getting to introduce you. Michael is probably one of the biggest living philosophers that we have today. I at least don't know any other philosopher who can fill up a football stadium with lectures about philosophy. His official title is that he's the Anti and Robert M. Bass Professor of Government at Harvard University. And to me, it's especially special to introduce Michael because, as some of you might know, I have a background myself in philosophy, the philosophy of economics. And I remember very clear the days when I was in university and we were like trying to figure out all these things with like, why are we using a concept of an individual that is presented by the maximization of a utility function, and what are the ingrained ideas about the individual in that? And in those discussions, we just kept coming back to Professor Sandel's early work, such as The Procedural Republic and The Unencumbered Self. And those kind of became a cornerstone, and we kept referring to them. So I'm a huge fan, and therefore it's a big honor to introduce him. Those books that we read then are probably not what you guys know, or even what Sandel is most famous for today. He has written so many books that I can't list them all. One is more famous than the other. The one that was called Liberalism and the Limits of Justice was probably one of the larger milestones of political philosophy in the 20th century. But his recent books are, of course, the ones where he's been a bestseller. And I know that he's translated into 27 languages. We're definitely dealing with a heavyweight. But the reason that he is here at the Questions Fair is, of course, the most recent books where he has engaged very deeply in a philosophical way with some of the underlying questions of economics. And there's a lot of people dealing with economics and the economy in our community. In the book from 2012, What Money Can't Buy, that INET also used to produce a video series. He engaged with the question of the role of markets and money in society and what role they should play in society, the moral limit of markets. And now he has a new book out, The Tyranny of Merit, just this year, where he's engaging with meritocracy, which I also think is a concept that is underpinning a lot of economic thinking. And it's exactly that type of questions that we wanted to engage with in the Questions Fair. And I can't say how happy we are to have Michael Sandel with us here to give us input to our discussion of finding the 100 most pertinent questions. But that's not all. This is not the typical format of our Questions Fair. For once, we have two people, so it's going to be a dialogue rather than a monologue before we get into the question editing session. We also have Rana Faruha. She is the associate editor at the Financial Times, and she's also a global analyst on CNN. But a lot of you know her because especially if you live in the United States, where I live, you also have seen her on TV. She's appearing on NPR, CBS, NBC, ABC, MSNBC, you name it. So she's also the author of a couple of books. And I think this discussion is going to be super interesting. And I'm at least ready to hear and ready to get started with this. So without further ado, I'll let Michael start the discussion.
Well, I just want to say how honored I am to be in conversation with Rana, whose work I greatly admire and in fact draw upon in my recent book, The Tyranny of Merit, What's Become of the Common Good. So I can't think of anyone I would rather be in conversation with on these subjects, Rana. Thank you so much for doing this.
Well, thanks, Michael, for having me as part of this discussion. Thanks, Thomas. I feel like my mother wrote that bio that you just read off. But Michael's the main act here, and I'm so pleased to be able to discuss this book, which actually I reviewed as one of 3 books for the Financial Times recently, The Tyranny of Merit, What's Become of the Common Good. And Michael, you and I have worked together with INET before on your last book, so I know you're thinking around some of these topics, but the topic of meritocracy has really come front and center. A number of people are talking about it, writing about it. This is really one of the most eloquent works on the subject that I've read. Maybe just for everyone's sort of edification, we could start by defining, what is meritocracy? What do you mean by the term?
Right. Well, thank you for beginning us with that question, Rana, because merit, most of us think of merit as a good thing. We want jobs to go to people who are well qualified for them. If I need surgery, I want a well qualified surgeon to perform it.
Yeah.
So merit is a good thing. Yeah. And yet merit has turned politically toxic. That's the somewhat paradoxical theme of the book anyhow. And the reason it's turned toxic has to do with our fractured civic life, with the polarization that seems to engulf us. The divide between winners and losers has been deepening. It's partly about inequality, but not only that, I think it's also about changing attitudes towards success. Those on top have come to believe that their success is their own doing, the measure of their merit, and by implication, that those who struggle have no one to blame but themselves. This leads to hubris among those on top. I call it meritocratic hubris, and humiliation and demoralization for those left behind by globalization. And this leads to anger and resentment and legitimate grievance that elites are looking down on those who struggle. And I think this sense of grievance, these unanswered resentments, have opened the way to the appeal of figures like Donald Trump in the US and other authoritarian populists who are roiling politics in countries around the world, Rana.
Boy, there's so much packed into what you just said. So I'm gonna start to parse it apart. Just thinking about meritocracy, as I have for some time, in part because I have a daughter that's just started at the University of Chicago, one of the hubs of meritocracy, and she was asked. Actually, they were reviewing their Maroon newspaper was reviewing your book, and she was asked to do a drawing of the feeling of the meritocracy, and she drew a sort of a ladder, staircase, stair step going up to a podium where a sad, crying figure was holding a trophy, and underneath the staircase were lots of crushed figures, and some of them invisible and some of them sort of contorted. And I mean, that's one of the ironic things, and it's something I've noticed. I know I'm a bit all over the place, but we'll connect the themes. The Black Lives Matter movement has fascinated me because there are not only civil rights leaders from the 60s and young African-American students who may or may not have had a chance to go to college, but there are a lot of young, wealthy, 4-year degree white kids joining this movement, I suspect, because they feel in some way, although the proportions are different, oppressed by this system where they are constantly tested. People like me, who are their parents, are working 3 jobs to pay for these incredibly expensive schools so that they can go work for McKinsey or Goldman Sachs or maybe be a famous academic or whatever. And everybody else that is not in this circle is somehow devalued. I mean, that's a lot of what you're talking about. How did we get here? Can you go back and take us through some of the historical points that we need to be thinking about?
Yes, and I think you've described very powerfully exactly what's unfolded, Rana. The tyranny of merit exerts its oppression in 2 directions at once. There are those you're describing in the cartoon who are left behind. And there are those on the podium who are wounded winners.
Yeah.
And we sometimes think of, actually, to take up your question, where did this come from? The term meritocracy was coined relatively recently in the late 1950s by a British sociologist, Michael Young, who wrote about the rise of the meritocracy. Now, these days, we think of meritocracy as an ideal, even an ideal of a just society. And political figures in recent decades have used the term this way. But when Michael Young coined the term, he thought of it as a dystopia.
Yeah.
He saw that the class-based arrangements of work and opportunity were breaking down in post-war Britain, and that was a good thing. The aristocracy was giving way to what he called meritocracy. But he glimpsed the dark side of it. And the dark side is that the closer we come to attaining a true meritocracy, true equality of opportunity, and we're certainly far from it, but the closer we get, the greater the tendency of those who succeed to believe they've earned it through their own effort and talent.
Yeah.
And the greater the tendency of those who struggle to ask themselves, maybe I do lack the effort and talent and drive to succeed. And that's deeply demoralizing.
Deaths of despair come from this, right?
I'm sorry, say it again?
This is where the deaths of despair,
yes,
by Angus Deaton and Ann Case, come from, yeah?
Yes, yeah, they've documented powerfully the increase in deaths of despair by drugs and alcohol and suicide that afflict more than any group those who lack a college education. And this fits with my account of meritocracy, of the tyranny of merit, and I draw on their remarkable book. Because why should it be concentrated among those who lack a college education? The reason, I think, is that the message we've been given during the age of globalization, the last 4 decades, is yes, it produces deepening inequalities, but if you want to compete and win in the global economy, go to college. If you're unhappy about stagnant wages and your job being outsourced, go to college. What you earn depends on what you learn. You can make it if you try. This was the mantra, the rhetoric of rising that politicians across the political spectrum offered as an answer, as if it were an answer to the inequality brought about by their version of globalization. But telling people to go to university, and that's the response to inequality, individual upward mobility, is woefully inadequate. It forgets the fact that most Americans don't have a 4-year college degree. Nearly 2/3 don't. So creating an economy that makes a necessary condition of dignified work a university degree that most people don't have it's a recipe for demoralization and resentment. And this, I think, fits with the findings, the stark findings about the deaths of despair. And it also accounts for the anger and resentment that fuels the populist backlash against elites and that roils our politics still.
No, absolutely. You know, as you're speaking, one of the things that I have found very difficult. I grew up in a red state, small farm town in Indiana, and so around many people that would have voted for Donald Trump in the last couple of elections. Not by and large, I believe, because they're horrible racists, but because they feel other than, they feel different, somehow sold out, patronized by conventional politics of both sides. And one of the things that that you mentioned, the hubris of meritocratic elites, the flip side is, of course, contempt, which you hear a lot of. There's a lot of contempt at the average Manhattan dinner party table about these people. And because, as you say, where we are in life under this new meritocratic system, relatively new since the post-war era, is no longer down to our birth, but down to our ability. And that's what the point Michael Young was making, that, now, back then, if you were a blue-collar worker or, several hundred years ago, a serf, well, it sort of sucked, but it wasn't your fault. You hadn't done anything wrong. And conversely, if you were a lord, that was pretty good, but maybe you also didn't necessarily think that you were the brightest bulb. You just thought, hey, I'm really lucky. Now it's our own fault. It's almost like it puts the Protestant work ethic on some kind of terrible hyperdrive where, we are not just unfortunate, but fundamentally bad people if we don't make it.
Right.
That's
right.
a burden. That's a real burden.
It's an enormous burden. And it's a burden, just as you suggest, that goes back a long way, even before Michael Young, to debates in early Christianity about whether salvation is the result of merit, the lives we live, the rites and rituals we observe, or whether it's by the grace of God, unrelated to our merit, unearned. And this debate raged among Christian theologians, and it, in a striking way, was the forerunner of our current debates about merit versus grace as an account of salvation. Now, these days, in largely secular societies, we're not debating so much the source of salvation as the source of success. To what extent is success the result of our own doing, the measure of our merit? And to what extent is success the result of many factors, including effort, but including lots of factors that are not our doing, having certain talents and gifts, for example, or living in a society and at a time when the talents and gifts we happen to have are prized. LeBron James is a great basketball player. He trains hard. He expends a lot of effort. But I could train 24 hours a day for a lifetime and wouldn't be as good a basketball player. He's enormously gifted. Is his remarkable athletic talent his doing or his good luck? And more than that, is the fact that he lives at a time and in a place where we love basketball and reward it handsomely, is that his doing, or is that also his good luck? If LeBron had lived back in the days of the Renaissance, when they didn't care much for basketball, he wouldn't have been rewarded as amply as he is today. So recognizing the role of contingency, luck, fortune in accounting for success is the beginning of a way to question the meritocratic hubris and even the contempt, Rana, that you're referring to and that you hear around us.
It's so interesting. I mean, I'm thinking about what you're talking about is getting rid of hubris and offering up humility. Luck is about humility. Hey, yes, I worked hard, but a lot of things went my way. This is a conversation that's playing out so much right now in the education sector. Education, I'd be curious what you would say to this, but it feels like it's about to go through a seismic disruption because we've got let's just speak about the US for a moment. We've got, 20 universities that cost $70,000 a year, but essentially you are rubber stamped if you go to one of these places and your meritocratic future is all but secure. We have a number of pretty good community colleges and state universities that you can also get a great education from. We have a lot in the middle where four-year colleges that might be charging a lot, kids in debt, what are they graduating with, any credentials, any skills, we don't know. Meanwhile, as COVID has shown us, all the changes that we knew were coming down the pipe to a digital environment, to an environment in which robots, AI, software can do more and more and more of what people can, is coming. It's coming faster. So back to, Black Lives Matter and the young four-year college grads that are underemployed marching together. Are we at some tipping point where a younger generation is going to say, wait a minute, I've just, in some kind of spent the last 12 years in some frantic race to try to go to the right college. I've graduated with a lot of debt. I don't know what I can do that software can't. I don't want any part of this. Are we there yet?
Well, I think we may be approaching that kind of frustration and rethinking born of frustration and even anger. I think that the big mistake we've made, and this on the face of it may seem provocative, especially coming from someone who's spent a career in higher education, I think the mistake we've made has been to cast higher education as the arbiter of opportunity in a meritocratic society.
Interesting.
We take this almost for granted, that higher education, especially selective colleges and universities, are the sorting machines. They are the instruments that confer the credentials and define the merit that a market-driven meritocratic society rewards. It's they who determine winners and losers. This is not good. This is something we need to rethink. Because for two reasons, and the cartoon you mentioned that your daughter at the University of Chicago on the newspaper brought to your attention brings this out. It's not good for those who are excluded, which is most people.
Yeah.
And it leads us, it's led us to a very steep hierarchy of prestige and reward and honor between higher education and other forms of learning on which most people actually depend to prepare themselves for the world of work. I'm thinking of state colleges, two-year community colleges, technical and vocation forms of learning. We woefully underinvest in these areas. Not only do we underinvest financially, but we fail to accord them the honor and respect that they and their students and their graduates are due. So that's part of the problem of casting higher education as a sorting machine. But the other damaging effect is it's not so good for higher education and the educational mission itself. Because the way well-off parents have figured out how to pass their privileges onto their kids, to our kids, requires converting the adolescent years and even before into a stress-strewn meritocratic gauntlet of intense pressure to achieve. And this shapes the way our kids emerge, even those who prevail in this meritocratic tournament. They arrive having been almost forced to conceive education in instrumental terms as an avenue to opportunity and credentials that will enable them to flourish in the meritocratic society. And they are so almost shell-shocked by the time they survive this meritocratic gauntlet that they arrive in college so accustomed to hoop jumping and networking and gathering credentials and packaging themselves, and that's not their fault, that's our fault, that there's relatively little room and space to step back and explore and ask what's worth caring about and why. What path do I really want to pursue? So for both reasons, from both directions, the tyranny of merit, which converts universities into sorting machines, is doing a disservice. And we need to rethink it and shift, I think, a focus away from arming people for meritocratic competition toward asking the question, what would it mean to renew the dignity of work for everyone, highly credentialed or not?
It's a great point. You're reminding me of a conversation I once had with Warren Buffett, where he said he was just marveled every day at the fact that he happened to have this strange set of skills, being able to look at a confluence of numbers and understand how they might play out over time in the marketplace, that was certainly no more, and probably, his words, less than what an excellent teacher in a local primary school might be able to do to get a child to feel good about the way that they learn. And yet, the top 10 hedge fund managers make more altogether than every teacher in the world, So we know, we all know, everyone who reads the FT, the Economists, your books, kind of knows that we have a set of problems that need a different and broader set of skills, of empathy, of caring, of sharing, of collaboration, the common good. How do we get there from where we are?
Well, it won't be easy because it requires, Rana, I think, that we take on some fundamental questions in politics and in public discourse that we are not accustomed to debating. And here's one. We easily assume that the money people make is the measure of their contribution to the common good. And yet, we can all think of examples, and you were just giving some, that show this is not the case. You mentioned the hedge fund managers. In your wonderful book, Makers and Takers, you discuss the growing financialization of the economy and the outsized rewards lavished upon those in the financial industry, those engaged in speculative finance, in high-speed trading, activities that are highly remunerated and rewarded, but whose connection to the productive economy, the real economy, and for that matter, the common good, is at best remote and tenuous. And compare that to the evident, tangible contribution to the common good made by teachers, nurses, caregivers, physicians. And yet, even physicians' pay is dwarfed by the pay of people engaged, let's say, in derivatives trading or in high frequency trading. And so what I think we need really to address this problem is to have a broader public debate about what counts as a valuable contribution to the common good. Now, we've shied away from that debate. What we've done in recent decades is we have outsourced our moral judgment to markets.
Yeah.
And we've just assumed the labor market will sort out the respective value of people's contributions to the common good. But at a time when the gap between the value of people's contributions and the rewards they receive financially, but also in terms of honor and esteem, is so vast, that gap, it's clear that really to come to terms with this problem, we have to raise questions and deliberate to reclaim as democratic citizens the question, what counts as a valuable contribution to the common good? And if I could just add, because Tomas and the organizers here want researchable questions for a new kind of economics, here's one. What is the theory of value that students of economics should explore and investigate once we recognize that the value of a social contribution to the economy or to the common good can't simply be read off from the market's verdict, the labor market?
That is such a great place to start. And Tomas, I think that you're cueing us that you want to now give us some questions from the audience. So let's go with that.
No, I was just trying to let you know how the procedure would be, but that's fine. I think we are ready to bring over some questions from the graph. So while the two of you have been discussing, there's a large group of students from YSI who have been suggesting questions. These questions are proposed views. If you look at the stream in the Zoom call, you can see the graph where all the suggested questions are. And these are potential future research questions for the YSI community. And they've found some that they would like to send over to us, to you two, for comment, and to see what do you think of them? Not necessarily as in an answer to the question, but also just the pertinence of the questions as such, since the whole point of this plenary is to find the most relevant questions. So if we go straight to question number one, it would be, should economics concern itself with how to live well, or is that something to leave to philosophers? So should economists concern themselves with this too?
Right. Well, now I'm tempted to answer the question rather directly, Tomas, which is, yes, economists should concern themselves with that question. Now, this suggests that the standard division of labor between economists on the one hand and philosophers on the other is misconceived. And I think it is misconceived. And if that's right, then economics needs to reconnect with its origins in moral and political philosophy. If you think back to the classical economists, from Adam Smith to Marx to John Stuart Mill, they were engaged in a broad subject that could be described as moral and political economy. They did not draw a sharp separation between so-called positive economics, that's value neutral, and normative questions. They considered economics to be a branch, a subfield of moral and political philosophy. And it seems to me that in thinking about how we should reconceive economics, economic research and economic argument and study and teaching, we should go back to that earlier conception where we give up the pretense that economics is a value-neutral science of human behavior and social choice. I think that's a kind of a folly, and perhaps a folly tinged with hubris, and reconnect and invite students of economics to reconnect their subject with broader questions about value, for example, which inescapably is a question about how to live, which is to say it's a question of philosophy.
I would agree with that. And I think that one of the reasons that we've had such disastrous outcomes from a lot of economic models, certainly in the last 40 years, a great financial crisis in the last 10, even people not really understanding how supply chains were going to respond in the midst of COVID. Again, just miscalculations. I think there's a tremendous amount of hubris still in the profession that these kind of neoclassical models or neoliberal politics, however you want to describe it, are infallible or even remotely close to infallible. I personally see economics moving into a post-neoliberal era. I think it's going to, I think the profession is already beginning to imagine itself as being a little bit more messy, humane, warmer, a bit more like biology if it's going to be a science, but perhaps even more a bit like an art. And I think that some of the most interesting and meaningful conversations are happening when economists come out of their silos and speak to neurobiologists and anthropologists and laborers and, real people. And in terms of whether or not economics should think about how to live well, I think it always has. What came to my mind, actually, while Michael was speaking, one of the things that came to my mind was the famous Keynes speech, Prospects for Our Grandchildren, in which that's exactly what he was thinking about. Wow, we're going to have all this new technology and it's going to make us able to live so well and actually to work so much less. And as we all probably know on this call, he was quite prescient about the size of the economy. He got that right 70 years out. He got the curve entirely wrong, which goes to Michael's point that those at the very bottom were working too much. Those in the middle really were underemployed, and those at the top were working too much and taking all of the value. And so we need to shift that curve.
Okay, thank you. So I've received another question from the graph, then I'll go straight to it. Question number 2, can economic systems of production, consumption, and distribution be fundamentally just? How can we design and maintain a sustainable and non-violent transition to a fairer economic system?
Well, I think this question raises the very important question about whether a theory of justice or a conception of the just society can inform economics, or whether it's a fundamentally different kind of question. And I think clearly it should inform economics, and figuring out the distribution of income and wealth and opportunities and power. The practical aspects of doing that involve economic questions, but how to do that requires a conception of justice. And I think the attempt to separate the two is misleading. Rana just now mentioned neoliberal models of economics and neoliberal politics. She mentioned them rightly, I think, in the same breath, and closely connected to neoliberal conceptions of economics and of politics is a faith in technocratic expertise as if it were a value-neutral mode of governing. And this is closely connected to the meritocratic hubris that we've been discussing. Because part of what makes so galling the governance of elites is not only that they've governed badly, that they've governed the global economy in a way that has deepened inequality and directed almost all of the economic growth to those already on top and left the bottom half with stagnant wages or worse. It also has contributed to the sense of grievance and anger and resentment that has upended our politics with the backlash that was predictable. And so I think for all of these reasons, we need to develop a way of doing economics and teaching economics that acknowledges from the start its inescapably normative dimensions.
Yeah, I would agree with all that. I would simply add that from a very kind of practical and newsy example, I think that the global push towards climate justice is a good place on a practical level for economics to focus its energy. You know, looking back, I've been studying the U.S. economic situation quite a lot and what the outcomes might be over the next few years. And I think that we are at the end, really, of what neoliberal sort of Chicago school policies can do with monetary policy. I think we need a real change at the ground level. And the only, historically, if you go back at least the last 100 years, maybe more, the only time there have been large-scale sustainable growth booms where productivity really rises and the productivity is linked to increasing wages, it tends to be when there is some big new project or shift in the economy that the public sector can seed, be it the rise of the railroads or the internet itself, both of which were sort of launched by the public sector but then invested in by the private sector. That's when you tend to get those sorts of big, sustainable, shareable booms. That's very different than just an iPhone that's in your pocket. We're talking about something big enough to put a lot of people to work, transition the economy in a good way. And I think there's a lot of interesting plans out there right now. And I'm hopeful, despite all the horrible politics at the moment, that at least some of these ideas are going to catch fire.
And if I could just add one further thought prompted by what Rana has said, Tomas.
Yes.
In thinking about what a new economics might look like, I think it would be less reliant on abstract models, the neoliberal models that Rana referred to. More attentive to normative questions, that's the point we've emphasized so far, but also at the same time more attentive to actual empirical studies about the effects of various economic policies or tendencies such as the financialization of the economy. In the world, part of what's been missing, I think, in mainstream model-centric positive economics has been a blindness to normative questions, but also a failure to actually do empirical studies about the effects. And here's one example. Well, the work of Raj Chetty, for example, is a good example of how empirical work can lend itself to debates about justice and the common good. To go back to the example Rana and I were discussing about higher education, it's been an article of meritocratic faith that getting into a university is an engine of upward mobility. That's why it's been presented as if it were the answer to inequality. But what Chetty and his colleagues have found empirically, by looking not only at selective colleges and universities, but at some, I think, 1,800 colleges and universities of all kinds, is that the percentage of students who enter in the bottom 20% coming from poor families and who wind up in the top 20% is less than 2%. So it's a mistake. And at places, Ivy League places, it's about 1.5, 1.2%. Not because attending these places doesn't give students a big edge in the job market, it does. But because there is such a class-skewed student population in these places to begin with. There are more students in Ivy League colleges from the top 1% of families than there are from the entire bottom half of the country put together. So colleges and universities, many of them, are like elevators, but elevators in a building that most people enter on the top floor. So they don't transport more than a tiny percent of students from the bottom to the top. And easy generalizations, meritocratic assumptions that universities will be the engines of upward mobility for a large number of people overlook this empirical finding, which is central to normative debates we have about whether we want to cast universities as sorting machines or whether we want to pursue other avenues to enable a broader politics of the common good and the dignity of work.
Okay, thank you. I like how the question somehow actually was two questions in one about justice and another one about the transition. And you still managed to answer both of them. So that's great. I think we have a little bit of time left. We can't spend too much time on the last question, but I want to bring it up. I think this one is mostly to Michael. Question number 3 is, one of the key theories of organizational justice is Adams' 1965 equity theory, which is based on meritocratic justice belief. What is the role of academia in the rise of the false belief in meritocracy?
I think we've been complicit. I think that higher education, now being cast as the arbiter of opportunity, is something that colleges and universities by themselves did not bring about. That was a role that we were cast in this role by the wider society and by the terms of public discourse and by the meritocratic faith that the response to inequality is to offer individual upward mobility through college. The wider society conferred that mandate on higher education, but higher education has embraced this role, I think, too uncritically and without recognizing the damage that playing this role takes on the social fabric and on the demoralizing effect on those who are left behind. But I think we've also not been clear-eyed enough about the damage we do to the educational mission itself and to our students by taking on this role as sorting machine, by taking on this credentializing function, which has begun to crowd out our intrinsic educational mission. And I think the way we teach, we talked earlier about the faith in technocratic expertise as the primary virtue of good governance. I think that universities, including departments of economics, have contributed to this faith in technocratic expertise. The idea that we should be governed by those who are well equipped to govern, that's an idea that goes back a very long way. But traditionally, if you go all the way back to Aristotle, the idea is that excellence in governance is not a matter of technocratic expertise. It's not value neutral. It depends on practical judgment and civic virtue and the ability to deliberate well about the common good, which in turn requires the ability to identify with people from all walks of life and their fears and their aspirations. And this notion of being equipped to govern well, this notion of practical judgment pulls apart from the idea of technocratic expertise that I do think the universities foster, as if we could be governed well by people who are well-schooled in a technocratic understanding of economics that claims to be value neutral while making hidden judgments all the time, implicit judgments about what's of value. And so I think we need to rethink the role of the university in relation to meritocracy. But we also need to rethink the way we teach the civic skills and the social sciences that equip young people to be leaders and to be democratic citizens. Rana, do you share this?
completely agree. And I was thinking, and I have my head sort of still in the U.S. election, but I feel happy that we have a president today, or president-elect, that says he's going to govern for all Americans and appears to be putting at least a little bit more diversity into leadership. I think that that's crucial. I mean, the idea that wisdom only comes from a certain kind of academic learning at a handful of universities is, I've always thought it was false. I'll stop there.
Okay, so
if I could just add one thought, Thomas, to what Rana has just said. We've been riveted on the presidency for understandable reasons. But one of the effects of the tyranny of merit is that if we look at representative government generally, members of Congress in the US, members of parliament in Britain and in Europe, the percentage of members of these representative bodies who come from working class backgrounds is just a tiny fraction of the proportion in society. About 2% only of members of Congress and of the Senate have any working class background, and only 3% in state legislatures. So what we've done essentially by making universities the arbiters of opportunity has not only been to leave people behind economically, not only to compound the grievances and resentments that arise when we do that, it's also been essentially to translate the diploma divide into representative government. So it's no wonder that a great many working people feel excluded, ignored, disempowered, as well as left behind economically.
So as ending remarks, I think this really emphasizes the pertinence of how these discussions about meritocracy really plays in with the current discussion and what's on our mind right now. So I hope we will now get to say goodbye to Michael Sandel and Rana Faruha, and we thank you so much for being here in the questions fair with us. For everyone else, remember that this is not the end of the session. We're still, all these questions that were submitted to Michael and Rana, we're going to keep working on them. We're going to rephrase them so they get the most exact phrasing that we can get to before we submit them into the questions graph where they can go into the further process. But okay, from here, thank you so much. Thank you to Michael Sandel. Thank you to Rana Faruha, and we'll see you in the constellation.
Thank you, Thomas, and thank you, Rana.
Thanks to you both.
Okay, thank you so much. That was amazing.
A quick welcome from the Lighthouse. Thank you so much, Michael and Rana. That was an amazing discussion. I'm going to go right in there right now with everybody else who's still in the constellation to refine those questions that have now been brought up. Many people are still in there, so let's send it right over to Cecilia, who's waiting for us.
So welcome back. We are about to start our question editing session, and wow, this has been a very challenging talk, and I'm sure that we have a lot of work to do. So let's start directly together now, rephrasing, refining, thinking, how can we improve the questions that were asked to Michael Sandel, among others, taking into consideration his own suggestions. And we will do this one by one, and feel free to jump in and motivate your rephrasings, comment upon the phrasings that are already there. And remember that the initial phrasing of each question has what we call as the incumbent advantage, because all the likes belong to this first phrasing. And I'm pretty sure that after listening to Michael and Rana commenting on these questions, you, as well as I do, you will be eager to change a bit these questions, improve them. So this is what this part of the session is about. So the first question, and I will read it for all of you, said, should economics concern itself with how to live well, or is that something to leave to philosophers? And I will highlight it so that you you know where we are, because now that question is second on the list. And it already has an alternative phrasing. I will not lie to you. This is a phrasing that I introduced, and it's actually a phrasing that I thought about while listening to Michael Sandel, because he was actually stating that, of course, the answer to this question was yes, but we could instead think of how actually should we, and I will directly read you the alternative phrasing I suggest here. How should we reconceive economics, considering its earlier conception of economics not as value neutral, but engaged in moral and political philosophy? So this is only one alternative phrasing that can actually help us think in terms of long-term research projects. This is why we tend to change the questions that are yes or no questions, because answering yes or no is kind of simple. And what we are really looking forward to is finding paths for future research. So feel free to add alternative phrasings as well, to change your likes if you prefer the second phrasing over the first one. And we will do the same thing with all the rest of the phrasings. Now we are almost on a tie between the first and the second phrasing. And since we don't have much time, maybe while you decide which phrasing you prefer, we can move on to the second question that was asked to Michael Sandel and Rana just some minutes ago. And this question was about, let me just read it to all of you. Can economic systems of production, consumption, and distribution be fundamentally just? And actually, as Thomas said when he was presenting the question, these are two questions in one. How can we, the second part of the question said, how can we design and maintain a sustainable and non-violent transition to a fairer economic system? I don't know if any of you wants to comment on this, but I may say a word, if not, because I was quite inspired by this talk. I enjoyed it a lot. And I think that this is a question that can lead us to start thinking about whether, and as Michael Sandel was saying, whether a theory of justice or a conception of a just society can inform economics, and in which respects. So I think this is definitely at the core of part of the discussions we are having. I do remember that one of the most liked, well, one of the favorite actually questions from all of the questions that we have in the question fair was a question suggested by Mariana Mazzucato, which actually was about how can we define public value. And I think this question also resonates with this idea of public value, of different forms of value, to rethink about what's fair, what's justice, and then try to focus on value in that respect or in that perspective. So there's someone asking how to see the questions, and you can see the questions. You can see them now just next to my face, but you need the way you to enter to every session. For those of you arriving late, is not only clicking on the Zoom link to join, but also opening on the right side of your screen the panel where you have all the different questions. You have a question list, and you will find first some questions that were suggested by Michael Sandel. And then you have other questions that were discussed during his talk, that were proposed by different participants of the talk, and that now we are editing and improving. And you have the link there that someone gently has just shared with you, but also the explanation is good for those of you following us on live stream. And this is way more fun than just being quiet looking at the screen. So let's go to the third question, because the first one doesn't seem to have an alternative phrasing, and it may be the case that it is a dense question and probably covers a lot of things. And the third one already has an alternative phrasing. I will read the first phrasing and the alternative as well, so that you can decide whether you want to change your like or not. or those of you arriving late may also want to like this question by placing their hearts. And while I was speaking, a third phrasing came up, so I will read them all. So original phrasing was, one of the key theories of organizational justice is Adams' 1965 equity theory, which is based on meritocratic justice beliefs. What is the role of academia in the rise of false belief in meritocracy? And then the two other options are, what is an educational vision that leads us to ask the right questions and live a good life? Or alternatively, you may like best the third option that says, one of the key theories of organizational justice is Adams' 1965 equity theory, which is based on meritocratic justice. Okay, but this last phrasing, let me just tell you that it's not actually a question. It's more of just a statement. So we are not going to consider this as an option because we're looking for questions. And the second one, in a way, is different from the first one, but it also resonates more with the talk. And I think it also makes sense to think of education in general and not only higher education and its role in a society that wants to move beyond market-driven meritocracy. So that's quite interesting. We have a question here. Yeah, so for those of you adding alternative questions to the Zoom chat, the way to add alternative phrasings or new questions is directly through the platform. So that's why we're coming and going between the Zoom talk and the platform, because it's the way we have to share collectively the questions and to start liking one question, because maybe your suggestions of alternative questions are preferred by most of the community, but the only way to know that is actually by entering the questions to the graph and then liking the different phrasings. So here we are also in a sort of tie. Still the first phrasing remains with most likes, but some of the likes were moved to the third phrasing. In the case of the first question, we've actually changed the question now, and we are staying with the alternative phrasing that was a question that was inspired by Michael Sandel's comments on the original phrasing. And yeah, now in fact, we have a third option for the third question about the role of academia that says, what can be the alternatives to the system of meritocracy? If we were to drift away from giving it much importance, what other alternatives exist? So we have a bunch of alternative phrasings and we're still deciding. I think that it may also be a good time to let you all know the difference between liking and favoriting. So inside the session, we are liking questions by placing hearts next to each phrasing or next to each question. But as you all know, the main goal of the YSR virtual plenary is to arrive at 100 questions that will guide, inspire, and contribute to our future projects and in different perspectives, research projects, events, if we can meet again in person, webinars, and so on. So to guide all our future activities, we need to arrive at these 100 questions. How this is done? By favoriting some of the questions. So each of the participants of the YSI plenary has 10, I'm sorry, it would be great to have 100, each participant has 10 favorites to place. Favorites are stars, and we can choose our favorites from all the different constellations, so from all the galaxy of questions. And perhaps this talk was as inspiring for you as it was for me, and you want to place some of your stars in some of these questions. It can be the questions that were suggested by Michael Sandel or the questions that we edited all together after the talk. In any case, to do that, I will now allow you to favorite questions, to place your star And if you do so, that question will be one of your 10 favorites. Once you arrive to 10 favorites, you will not be able to select any more questions. But if you want to do it, you can just unclick one of your stars and change one of your favorites. And by doing this collectively all together, we will arrive at the 100 most pertinent questions. This is why it's so important to place your stars, to keep in mind that there are many constellations in the sky, and that inside each of these constellations, there are many, many questions. And these questions are changing day after day with all the different sessions we are hosting inside the question fair. So I think we are now ready to wrap up, to finish this session. You will have some minutes to place your stars, if any of the questions that were discussed today are among your favorites, or you may do that later as well. And with this, I will just pass it on to studio.
And welcome back. Behind me, you can see the entire galaxy of stars, and the ones that are highlighted up here and here are the ones we've just discussed. The biggest ones that you see highlighted there are the ones exactly as Cecilia mentioned, the most favorited, the ones that have gotten the most attention from you, and your participants, our participants in the YSI plenary, are considering the most pertinent questions so far. Now, as we dive into the societal organization constellation, we can take a look which are currently the most popular questions. As you know, all the ones that are currently connected are the ones that are currently also in the list of the 100 most liked questions overall, not just in this constellation. But let's take a look at the first question on the list here in the societal organization constellation. It reads, what is the connection between the deepening inequality of recent decades and the growing prominence of meritocratic belief that the winners deserve their success? And guess what? That question was posed by Michael Sandel, who just spoke in the earlier constellation. He received those 5 likes by participants who just joined the previous constellation questions discussion. Let's take a look at the second one, which was also posed by Michael Sandel and received 4 favorites so far. If chances were truly equal and markets were perfectly competitive, would market outcomes reflect what people deserve? If not by markets, how can we determine the value of a person's contribution to the common good? And the third question is one that also relates to this discussion, and we can go further down the list to just look at all the questions that are currently being liked and are part of the constellation so far. Now, I invite you to go in and move this order by liking the question you like most. There's many questions that deserve attention and your likes potentially. And if you think another question should be listed amongst the 100 most liked question, then it's your chance to change the nature of our galaxy. We have now zoomed out. This is the entire galaxy, and this is the update from the studio. We'll see you at the top of the hour with Daniel Ellsberg and Rob Johnson for a live interview. Don't miss that.